With a wriggle of its golden tail, Snowflake brushed the golden light beam away. The space and ethereal summit was big enough for the treasure and the beast to fight. However, if they got serious, Snowflake's body could fill the entire valley, while the golden shield could cover the entire mountain. Right now, Snowflake could even fight with a top-tier Nascent Soul Realm cultivator. From 5th Heaven to 7th Heaven, only Axel, the level 6 demon beast which guarded Sky Mountain Sect, had a higher realm than Snowflake. However, Axel was more than 1,000 years old, while Snowflake was only about 200 years old. If the ancestors of Sky Mountain Sect had seen such an elevation speed, they would have been shocked. After Snowflake got to level 5 with the aid of a level 10 demon core, it'd be hard for Snowflake to elevate to a higher level. The green treasure sword suddenly shot out from Sophie's cave. Pale-faced, Sophie leaped lightly from the entrance of the cave and stepped onto the green treasure sword. She mumbled something, and the green treasure sword under her feet instantly changed to 4 positions. The first 4 chapters of the Big Dipper constellation scroll. Then Sophie kicked on the handle of the sword lightly, and the green treasure sword jumped up lightly into her hand. When the sword slashed, starry lights flashed. It looked as if many stars had appeared, and 4 stars were the biggest. Jacob decided to test her strength, and shot out 4 sword energies with the power of the 3rd level towards the 4 stars. With the twitching of Sophie's sword tip, the 4 stars changed direction suddenly. Jacob controlled the sword energies with his spiritual senses and made them go on. The valley shook in the morning light. Sophie's starry lights were powerful. When the weak sword energy shattered, Sophie's 4 starry lights were still intact. The Big Dipper constellation scroll was from 7th Heaven. It was full of infinite mysteries. In the past, when she practiced the first 3 chapters of this scroll, she could only use separate sword forms. But after reaching the core formation realm, she could use the 4th one as well, thus completing the first set of techniques. She moved her feet, and the sword shot out a string of starry lights with crackling sounds. Although she could only cover a small range, it was still very powerful. Sophie could cover a range of 500 meters with the 4 starry lights. When Alina was at the low-tier core formation realm, she hadn't been able to refine the green treasure sword into her natal treasure, and couldn't shoot out the stars. However, Sophie was extremely smart, and had gained a total understanding of them. Happily, Sophie put away the green treasure sword, and it vanished in her palm. In the past, Sophie couldn't put the long and wide green treasure sword into her storage space, and wasn't able to bring it back. Now that she'd refined it into her natal treasure, she could bring it anywhere she wanted. Jacob was surprised at the power of Sophie's sword technique. Before he could say anything to her, they both heard a voice. Elder Finn from Sky Mountain Sect greets Herb King Master. A clear and resonant voice came from outside the valley. Jacob looked through the mist and saw Elder Finn. The latter was now wearing a gray robe with ancient patterns, and he sat on the level 6 snow line, Axel. While he spoke, he bowed and paid respect to Ethereal Summit. Beside Elder Finn was Elliot, Master of the Sky Mountain Sect, who sat on the level 5 snow lion Lily. Behind them were 8 disciples who were riding on level 4 snow lions, including Toby, who had been beaten to the Foundation Establishment realm by Jacob. Sophie looked at Jacob with concern. Snowflake, Jacob called out, and Snowflake, who had reached level 5, immediately transformed into its snowline form, which was the size of 5 people, and carried Jacob on its back. When Jacob flew out of the valley, Sophie also followed him on her sword after a moment of consideration. Hovering in the sky outside of Ethereal Summit, Elder Finn and the others saw Jacob coming out of the valley while riding on a snowline, followed by a female cultivator. The female cultivator was stepping on the green treasure sword, an ultimate treasure of the Sky Mountain Sect. Jacob looked at Elder Finn and found that he, who only had weak nature essence last night, had recovered to the core formation realm. Toby looked like he recovered a lot, even though he wasn't back at the core formation realm yet. We are sorry that Sky Mountain Sect offended Ethereal Summit several times. Today I've recovered a bit and come to beg for your forgiveness. Elder Finn said to Jacob with a gentle expression. Okay, Jacob nodded. The core formation realm cultivators standing behind Elder Finn saw Sophie. They remembered that she was only at the Foundation establishment realm last night, but it looked like she now was at the core formation realm. It convinced them that Sophie had indeed hidden her realm last night. In the cultivation world, it's extraordinary to have a core formation realm female cultivator as a cultivation partner. However, the Herb King Master has several powerful maids, including Alina, which shows his status, they thought. Since Alina had declared that she had cut off all ties with Sky Mountain Sect, it was hard for them to gain favor from the Herb King Master. However, it would be great if the Herb King Master forgave Sky Mountain Sect for its past offenses. I learned that your partner is cultivating the Big Dipper Constellation Scroll from Sky Mountain Sect. So, I brought the second half of the scroll. Elder Finn looked at Jacob and continued. Standing on the green treasure sword, Sophie perked up at his words. That's good. Jacob nodded with a smile. If Elder Finn only came to apologize with a group of people, it would mean nothing. However, they solved Jacob's problem by bringing the second half of the Big Dipper Constellation Scroll. After reaching the core formation realm and refining the green treasure sword, Sophie could now use the first 4 sword techniques in the scroll continuously. However, she had only the first half of the scroll. If she wanted to continue cultivating, they had to think of a way to get the second half. Since the second half of the scroll was in Sky Mountain Sect, Jacob would have to force them to hand the scroll over. He didn't want to force others. Now that the Sky Mountain Sect offered the scroll on their own, Jacob wouldn't need to mess with them again. Jacob shot out a sword energy that took the second half of the scroll from Elder Finn's hand. Sitting on the back of his level 6 snow line, Elder Finn was silently amazed by the nimbleness of Jacob's invisible sword energy, which swept across his palm accurately. Take a look. The sword energy brought it to Sophie afterward. She caught the scroll and flipped through several pages before smiling at Jacob. It was indeed the second half of the Big Dipper Constellation Scroll that she had wanted. Elder Finn took the opportunity to observe Sophie and found that she was standing on the green treasure sword. He sighed silently since he knew that this young girl had refined the green treasure sword. Both the green treasure sword and the Big Dipper Constellation Scroll were the top-tier items that Sky Mountain Sect had prepared for Alina. However, Alina had now left Sky Mountain Sect, and an outsider had taken these 2 items. Since the sword had been refined into a natal treasure, it was impossible to take it back, even if they wanted to trade it with a lot of treasures. The most humiliating thing for Sky Mountain Sect wasn't that an outsider took their green treasure sword. Instead, it was that they had to offer the second half of the scroll after the first half of the technique had been taken by force. It was like offering his right cheek to the enemy, who had just slapped his left cheek. They were powerless in this situation. After all, the Herb King Master possessed extreme power, and even his mount was a level 5 snowline, let alone his possession of a supreme spiritual treasure. Elder Finn shook his head silently in defeat. Despite all the unfortunate events that had happened to Sky Mountain Sect, he felt fortunate that he could cultivate again, and had hopes of returning to the Nascent Soul Realm after cultivating in seclusion for a while. There was still the chance that Sky Mountain Sect could go back to its former glory. Sitting on the back of the level 5 snow line, Lily, Elliot looked towards the ethereal summit, which was covered in mist, hoping to see Alina again. However, Alina was now following the powerful Herb King Master, and he couldn't see or ask about her, even though she was his daughter. Sky Mountain Sect is thankful for the Herb King Master's generosity. If Master has any errands in the future, we will do our best to help, Elder Finn said while bowing again. Facing the Herb King Master, who had almost destroyed Sky Mountain Sect, they didn't dare to hold any grudges. Instead, they showed their intention of following the ethereal summit. It seemed humiliating, but it was an act in the interest of the Sky Mountain Sect. If they wanted to maintain their status on 6th Heaven, they must attach themselves to ethereal summit. Standing behind Elliot, Toby's face was dark. At the Foundation Establishment realm, he was the only cultivator among the group whose realm was below the core formation realm. Obviously, he was brought along to beg for forgiveness. However, Jacob's gaze swept across his face without any intention to punish him. Standing on the green treasure sword, Sophie glared at him and remembered that she had been chased around and almost killed by Toby. At that time, Toby was at the core formation realm, and Sophie was at the Foundation Establishment realm. However, the tables had turned now. Sophie was now at the core formation realm, while Toby was at the Foundation Establishment realm. Their strengths had been completely reversed. If Sophie attacked, Toby would have to run around the mountains. Things change, but Toby had never imagined that the situation would change so fast. By the way, the emergence of the Supreme Spiritual Treasure last night seemed to have attracted the attention of some masters on Seventh Heaven. Elder Finn continued after a pause of several seconds. Oh? Jacob became a little alarmed. There were several soul formation realm cultivators on Seventh Heaven. That was why the sects on Sixth Heaven couldn't elevate to Seventh Heaven easily. To elevate to Seventh Heaven, Sky Mountain sect had accumulated strength for hundreds of years, but all their efforts went to waste due to the incident with Ethereal Summit. If Elder Finn had remained at the peak in the Ascent Soul Realm, Sky Mountain sect might have had a chance at moving to Seventh Heaven with the help of Axel. If they had a soul formation realm cultivator, they could surely move up to Seventh Heaven. Despite the small number of sects in Seventh Heaven, they each had the power which could suppress Fifth and Sixth Heaven both. If they targeted Ethereal Summit, it would be a disaster. Jacob wasn't confident that he could battle with soul formation realm cultivators, especially the ones who were the overlords in their sects. Had the Golden Shield messed around on Seventh Heaven, the powerful cultivators would potentially be able to capture it easily. After reaching level 2 as a Supreme Spiritual Treasure, the Golden Shield could almost be called the strongest shield in the world, qualified to be a treasure for a soul formation realm cultivator. Knowing Irene's personality, Jacob knew that she wouldn't mind anything, as long as Kathy wasn't hurt, and she wouldn't care if Jacob lost his treasure. Irene practiced notes that could change into many forms, and thus didn't need treasures. But it wasn't the case for other soul formation realm cultivators. Okay, I got it. Jacob looked calm. The Golden Shield could run wild on 5th and 6th Heaven, and it was time to restrain it. Otherwise, some soul formation realm cultivators on 7th Heaven would probably find a reason to take it. Jacob still counted on it to block some powerful 8th level dragon cultivators, so he wouldn't want it to be taken by the soul formation realm cultivators. Farewell. Elder Finn turned to 6th Heaven with Elliot and the 8 disciples. Sky Mountain sect must attach itself to Ethereal Summit to survive. Jacob looked at the sky and realized that it was almost time to return to land. He beckoned at Sophie, and she sat behind him on Snowflake's back, putting her sword back inside her body. Even though she could finally take her treasure back home with her, she currently didn't have enough nature essence to fly on it all the way. She was still recovering from her realm elevation. The news that Sky Mountain sect brought about 7th Heaven was very important. Jacob had dealings with 5th and 6th Heaven, but he had neglected 7th Heaven. Seeing that Jacob was ready to return to land, the Golden Shield flew from Ethereal Summit and followed him like a shadow. Snowflake circulated its demonic essence and turned golden all over before flying towards First Heaven. So, you can take care of the Golden Shield while it's on land, Jacob said to Sophie while sitting on Snowflake. What? She looked at Jacob in surprise. The Golden Shield silently flew alongside Snowflake. I'll give you a white cloth that can nurture treasures. You can scrub it when you have time, Jacob said and took the wish cloth out of his storage space. Okay. Sophie held the cloth and looked at the Golden Shield. The shield flew over and touched Sophie's palm. After glancing at Jacob in surprise, she tried to scrub the surface of the shield carefully. Lying comfortably on her hand, the Golden Shield turned vigorously to rub against the wish cloth. It's as shameless as Snowflake, Jacob thought after seeing the Golden Shield's behavior. While some nascent soul realm cultivators had never seen a supreme spiritual treasure all their lives, Sophie could scrub it as a core formation realm cultivator. If those nascent soul realm cultivators could see this sight, they would be green with envy. The supreme spiritual treasure could strengthen itself by following the super powerful cultivators, and low-level cultivators could also strengthen themselves by being in contact with the supreme spiritual treasure constantly. Cultivating with the supreme spiritual treasure around her, Sophie could increase her cultivation speed. There was an agreement between Jacob and the Golden Shield. Jacob had to get rid of the black rust for it. The shield's dark appearance didn't match its current realm and status, which was why it did everything it could to make Sophie scrub the black rust from its body. After all, only a shiny golden appearance could match its status as a celestial treasure. Like an ancient broken tool, the Golden Shield moved around the wishcloth. Okay, just scrub it for a little while each day. You won't be satisfied even if you scrub it for 5 hours non-stop, Jacob said after taking the wishcloth from Sophie's hand. Seeing the wishcloth leaving her hand, the Golden Shield followed it to rub against it. Okay, I got it. With a smile, Sophie put the wishcloth into her storage space. The Golden Shield moved around Sophie anxiously, wanting to scrub one smaller black dot on one corner of its surface. But she had put away the wishcloth already. Jacob had agreed to clean its body, but didn't set the time for the job. He could finish the job in 5 to 6 days or weeks. So it must stay with Jacob if it wanted to become pretty again. From now on, you stay with Sophie when you're on the land, Jacob said to the Golden Shield, not caring if it understood his words. He would bring the Golden Shield with him to 5th and 6th heaven, but in the meantime, he was afraid that some ignorant and block-headed soul formation realm cultivator would make a move against Sophie. Moving around Sophie, the Golden Shield saw that she had put away the wishcloth, and it couldn't squeeze into her storage ring. Then it changed into a black button and attached itself to her collar. You are smart, Jacob said with a smile. The supreme spiritual treasures weren't very smart, but they possessed the intelligence of 1 to 2-year-old children. Snowflake, on the other hand, had the intelligence of a 3 to 4-year-old child. Except for the fact that it couldn't speak, it was able to think logically. Sophie was the princess of the North Atlantic Dragon Clan, and had a top-tier natal treasure, and the colorful dress a Lady Carter gave her. Ordinary people wouldn't dare to mess with her. At this thought, Jacob looked back and saw Sophie looking ahead, lost in her thoughts. Suddenly, another thought struck him. With Sophie's core formation realm and strong physique, it might be the time to return the dragon core to her. Behind him, Sophie blushed and raised an eyebrow at Jacob when she saw him looking back at her. Snowflake pierced the white clouds and entered first heaven. After dropping to the land, it tumbled and turned into a golden squirrel that was as big as half a palm before crawling from Sophie's feet to her shoulder. Sophie looked at it in surprise, not expecting Snowflake to change like this. A level 4 snow lion could turn bigger, but couldn't turn smaller. However, a level 5 snow lion could change its size and shape at will. After seeing Lily, the level 5 snow lion, Snowflake realized that it could turn all its fur into a golden color, and even transform into small and nimble animals. Jacob pointed out a finger and tapped Snowflake's nose. Alina had been so proud when she sat on Lily, and despised Snowflake. But now that mortal snow lion had reached level 5 as well. Each demon beast had the bloodline of an ancient godly beast, but the intensity of godly beast bloodline was different. According to Sky Mountain Sect, snow lions could only reach level 6. However, Jacob knew that Sky Mountain Sect didn't have the complete transformation scroll, and the nature essence intensity on 6th heaven was far less than that in the Demon Sea. If Snowflake could continue cultivating, it had the chance of reaching level 10. Looking at Snowflake, who was jumping around on Sophie's shoulder, Jacob wondered how Snowflake would look at level 10, and how it would look after transformation. So cute! Sophie reached up to pet its small head. Let's go to class. Jacob touched Sophie's wrist. Okay. Sophie picked up Snowflake and put it into her pocket before walking towards the campus with Jacob. "He's Dr. Walter's son." Even the TV stations interviewed the calligraphy club, and it was released in yesterday's news. It's said that he's a good friend of Sarah Martin. How come I didn't see that before? While Jacob and Sophie walked on the campus, the people around them began to talk among themselves. After yesterday's club activity, he had become a celebrity in the college. The titles of Walter's son and Sarah's good friend were enough for people to gossip about him. Others thought that he had purposefully kept a low profile in the past by speaking nothing about his family background, even though his parents' social connections were way more powerful than Michael's father's. Walking beside Jacob, Sophie looked fresh and elegant, while a breeze caressed her face. Only such an elegant beauty can match Jacob, the students thought. In yesterday's club activity, they had seen with their own eyes that Sophie was very familiar with Jacob's parents and grandma, and they guessed that her relationship with Jacob had been recognized and accepted by Jacob's family. Judging from the relationship between her and Jacob's parents, other students guessed that her relationship with Jacob must be steady, and she must have known Jacob's parents for a while. All kinds of envy, jealousy, and hatred rose in a lot of girls' hearts. If they had known about Jacob's great background earlier, they would have pursued him themselves. Just like in her old high school, no one here knew Sophie's family background, and how she was the only daughter of the most successful businessman in not only their city, but the entire state. Jacob and Sophie were a perfect match from every perspective. No one in the college could separate them. Even the girls who wanted Jacob had to face reality reluctantly. Just then, Susan walked out of a building in front of them. "Hey, Susan." Sophie immediately greeted Susan after seeing her walking towards them. "Hey." Susan smiled briefly and looked at Jacob. "We'll be leaving tomorrow. You come to my home tonight." Her tone was cold and indisputable. Baffled, Sophie looked at Susan, and then Jacob, wondering what Susan was talking about. However, she didn't feel it was right to interrupt. "I have college," Jacob started. "I've talked to Liam, and you'll take a 1-week leave," Susan interrupted him. Okay." Jacob knew that the time was near, but didn't expect Susan not to give him any time to prepare. "Well, we may never return," Susan suddenly continued. Jacob's heart dropped, and he sweated when he looked at Susan's cold face. Taking a 1-week leave, and might never return. Susan was always cold, but never brutal. In fact, she was even easygoing occasionally. Jacob knew that her ice-cold expression would only appear when she met someone she didn't like. Or she was very nervous. The Nine-Dragon Palace was not less dangerous than the Demon Sea. Susan and Jacob were going to face Thomas, one of the ancestors of all dragons, and he was fiercer than Lady Carter. That's all. Susan turned sideways and walked around them towards the cafeteria calmly. Sophie turned her head and looked at Susan helplessly. What did she mean? They might not return. "Let's go." Seeing Sophie standing there in a daze, Jacob held her hand and strode towards the dorms. There, they parted ways and went to their respective rooms to get ready for class. By the time Jacob took a shower and left for class, he was late. So when he entered the room, everyone looked at him and immediately started whispering among themselves. Sorry, I'm late." After apologizing in a low voice, Jacob walked into the classroom and found a seat beside Jade and Julia. They had thought that Jacob was doing well in college, but they never imagined that he was Walter and Mila's son. He was a special figure. The 4 classes passed in the blink of an eye. While Jacob was helping Jade and Julia pack up, Zach appeared at the door and called them over. Beside him was Andrew, the royal prince of the Frost Mountain Dragon clan, who had just transferred to their college. They're probably here to invite me to lunch. Jacob smiled and thought. Zack had introduced the royal prince of the Frost Mountain Dragon Clan to this college due to his admiration of Jacob. From the perspective of the North Atlantic Dragon Clan, Jacob should get to know him better. When Jacob walked to the door, he saw a big group of young men standing on the other side of the door. "Jacob!" Zack looked at Jacob and started saying with a little awkwardness, "They are all from different dragon clans. Andrew invited some of them here, and others are friends of our friends." Jacob looked at them and realized that there were more than 30 young men there. They had different realms and elemental attributes. Also, some dressed extravagantly, while others wore plain clothes. "This is the royal prince of the Tiger's Mountain Dragon Clan. This is the royal prince of the Misty Lake Dragon Clan. This is the royal princess of the Goldie Mountain Dragon Clan." Zack introduced some guys beside him. Jacob remembered that Draken had mentioned that some royals of other dragon clans would come to study in the city before leaving, and he was surprised that these dragon clans had acted so quickly. The princes and princesses of these dragon clans had come to the university together just the next day. "They are here to take a look first. Their registration are still in process," Zack continued. While he was dealing with some business in the office of the Calligraphy Club, a large group of dragon cultivators suddenly came in. They were all young royal princes and princesses of different dragon clans, and they'd come to meet Jacob. That was why Zack had led them to find him here. In the dragon circle, Jacob was very famous, especially among the younger generation. The dragon kings and elders who had come to see the calligraphy exhibition praised Jacob after they returned to their respective dragon clans. His achievements had spread among different dragon clans instantly. Since he had stood out in the Dragon God Shrine's general exams and became a level 4 inspector, the young nobles were all curious about him, which was why they came to the city to see him, with some doubts and admiration in their hearts. Escorted by their elders, the young dragon cultivators had flown to the city during the night from all corners of the world. Now that they saw Jacob's ordinary look, they began to wonder if he was as powerful as the rumors said. "Good. Now that you're here, you are my friends. I'll invite you all to lunch," Jacob said generously. Kathy, Jade, and Julia also joined them at the door after packing up their stuff, and Jacob informed them about the lunch. He texted Sophie on the way, but she was unfortunately still stuck in class. When Jacob led them to the restaurant complex outside the campus, the royal heirs swarmed after him. The dragon cultivators held a connection conference every few years, but this important large-scale meeting discussed important issues and was attended only by the rulers of the dragon clans. The younger generation was left at home to guard the dragon palaces. These royal princes and princesses would inherit the dragon clans in the future, which was why the dragon kings were very strict with their upbringings, not allowing them to go out and have fun. However, their fathers had allowed them to go out and study in a foreign city unprecedentedly, which brought them great excitement. After walking out of the college's west gate, Jacob led them to the second floor of a fancy restaurant at the complex. As a considerate guy, Zack arranged the seats for them. Most of the royal princes and princesses were here at the university for the first time, and some even had never visited the country before. They were extremely curious and excited about everything. Since they couldn't leave the dragon palaces without permission, and their behaviors were strictly restrained by rules, they had been granted special permission by their fathers this time to come to the city and investigate. "Let's introduce ourselves," Jacob stood up graciously and said. "I'm Jacob, and these are my friends, Kathy, Jade, and Julia. My fiancée Sophie couldn't join us right now." They all knew that Jacob was the prince consort of the North Atlantic Dragon Clan, and was engaged to the young princess of the clan. They were excited to meet the North Atlantic princess, but got disappointed to hear that she wouldn't be meeting them. Since they would inherit the dragon clans, the heirs must choose their mates early. It was a norm in the dragon clan to be at least engaged by 15, and married by 18 or 20. Despite their young looks, all the people here had their own fiancés, and some were even already married. It's said that Jacob has great power in the North Atlantic Dragon Clan, since he could move the troops of North Atlantic and was very mighty. The North Atlantic Dragon Clan had placed so much trust in Jacob that they almost gave the entire clan to him. After Jacob introduced himself, the royal princes and princesses all introduced themselves one by one. They all came for Jacob, and it was a happy gathering. Many dragon kings had sent their children to the university, almost forming a short-term training camp with the hope that they could establish connections with other clans. After 2, 3, or 4 years, they would establish precious connections that would benefit them for life. These dragon kings had sent their children to a city under the North Atlantic's rule, instead of other cities, due to the gradual uprise of the North Atlantic Dragon Clan. Besides, the Dragon King were sure that their children would trust and accept. Jacob is so powerful that he exchanged more than 30 rounds of attacks with that old peak 8th level metal elemental dragon. Andrew told others about Jacob's achievements while they ate. When he was invited to the university by Zach, he had been doubtful of Jacob's power. But after watching yesterday's fierce battle, he was completely convinced by Jacob. He wouldn't be able to match Jacob's power even after cultivating 200 more years. It wasn't good luck, but true power that placed Jacob in the future ruling position of the North Atlantic Dragon Clan. If Jacob weren't so powerful, the North Atlantic Dragon King wouldn't give the clan to him so willingly. While Andrew talked about what he saw yesterday, the others looked doubtful. After all, they couldn't even take half a strike from a peak 8th level cultivator. They wouldn't believe Andrew's words if their fathers hadn't told them after returning to their dragon clans. With lights flashing in their eyes, they looked at Jacob, wanted to ask him to show his strength, but didn't dare to invite him to a practice battle so rashly. After all, they had just met and were all royal heirs. It wouldn't look good if they lost right away. Jacob ate with a smile on his face and didn't interrupt Andrew's talk. These people were all important figures in their own regions, and here they were, focusing on Jacob. For most of these people, it was the first time that they met each other, but they got along well. Without the restraint of their fathers and elders, they all talked with each other freely. What they didn't know was that, despite his calmness, Jacob, the president of the Calligraphy Club, which they would soon join, was going to venture into the 9-Dragon Palace, the holy place of the dragon tribe. Entering the 9-Dragon Palace meant a high probability of death. The 9-Dragon Palace was the safest when the 4 Ocean Dragon clans opened it together. But it was another story if one decided to break into it. With Thomas cultivating in the 9-Dragon Palace in seclusion, the 4 Ocean Dragon clans wouldn't open it for a while. After lunch, they talked until the evening. All these people from different dragon clans gained a great interest in life in the city, and they even considered bringing their respective husbands and wives to the college as well. Some of them wanted to bring their favorite brother or sister here to try the student life at this university. They were just toying with these ideas, but it would surely get Liam, the vice principal, quite busy. After all, who could have expected that these royal princes and princesses would want to bring their families here? Several of them looked young, but had kids already. It would be a mess if these young-looking college students were to be seen with their children by their peers. They walked out of the restaurant laughing and having a good time. After dropping Kathy and the twins in front of their dorms, Jacob turned back and went to the library where Sophie agreed to wait for him after her class ended. Sophie was standing outside the library door when he got there. Let's walk," she said. Jacob could tell that something was wrong, but kept quiet to give her the time to tell him herself. After walking together in silence for a while, Sophie clenched her hands and finally asked, "What was Susan talking about in the morning? Why did she say you might not come back?" She's asked me to go to the 9-Dragon Palace with her," Jacob answered. "But the 9-Dragon Palace is very dangerous." Sophie stopped and caught Jacob's hand. She had heard all about the dangers of that place if someone tried to break in. "I know, but it's important," Jacob said. "But..." Sophie's tense expression softened, I don't want you to go." It sounded like she was pleading in desperation. She had suppressed her curiosity for half a day. She didn't want to interfere with Jacob and Susan's business, but she also didn't want them to be in danger. Her thoughts were contradicting each other. Seeing her hesitating expression, Jacob instantly understood how Elder Kayla felt when Kenneth said farewell to her before he headed to the Demon Sea to gain battle experience. At that time, Kenneth and Elder Kayla had just experienced a breakthrough in their relationship. On that Dragon Boat Festival, Kenneth and Elder Kayla were walking by the river while eating ice cream and laughing. That was the happiest and most relaxed moment for both. When Elder Kayla saw Kenneth off, her expression looked almost the same as Sophie's right now. However, Kenneth returned safely. "It's dangerous, but it's also a chance for me to break through," Jacob said while looking at her. He held her hands tightly, trying to console her. When he came back from the Demon Sea, he understood what a narrow escape meant. The path of cultivation was full of difficulties. If not for Alina's appearance, Jacob would have died in the Demon Sea. However, he couldn't count on anyone to rescue him in the Nine Dragon Palace. The Nine Dragon Palace was an enclosed space, and it was hard to know what dangers were lurking inside. Biting her lip, Sophie looked at him and was at a loss for words. If Jacob doesn't come back, what would happen to Grandma? She thought. She wanted Jacob to think twice before he acted, but she worried that such comments would add to his burden. Take care of my parents and Grandma, Jacob said as if he had seen through her thoughts. Susan wanted to break through, so he must help her in the adventure into the Nine Dragon Palace. He made a promise to her, and he was paying back the gratitude that he owed Susan. This breakthrough was Susan's ultimate goal. However, he knew that if he went back on his words and didn't go to the Nine Dragon Palace, Susan wouldn't force him. She would find a way to get there by herself. He didn't want her to take the risk alone. In the Nine Dragon Palace, only his Sword Shadow Scroll could work. Can I go with you? Sophie asked hesitantly. She knew that she wasn't as strong as Jacob or Susan, but she wanted to help them anyway. I'm going with Susan, and only 2 people can enter, Jacob said. As the ancestral place of the dragon tribe, the Nine Dragon Palace was more dangerous to cultivators without dragon cores. Sophie looked at Jacob quietly while her gaze lingered on his face. Despite her best wishes, she was afraid that she wouldn't see him again. However, the brightness in Jacob's eyes told her that he was determined and will try his best to come back to her. Check up on my parents and Grandma for me, Jacob repeated. He was afraid that he wouldn't be able to come back, but he was never a coward and wouldn't back out after promising Susan. Standing on her toes, Sophie wrapped her arms around Jacob's neck tightly. Jacob and Sophie both held on to each other tightly for a while. You better come back safe, or else I'll kill you with my own sword, she whispered into his ear. Jacob had experienced all kinds of dangers on his path of cultivation. If he only wanted to enjoy comfort in a safe environment, he would live comfortably under the protection of the North Atlantic Dragon Clan and enjoy being with Sophie. However, it was his creed to protect the people around him with all his abilities, especially Sophie. Absolutely. I'll come back in one piece, Jacob said with a smile. Only she would threaten him at a time like this. While Jacob continues to do his best, you'll encounter more dangers. Sophie thought of something. She loosened her arms and placed her hands on Jacob's shoulders, staring into his eyes. Her gaze was full of love. I've got to go. Please take care of yourself while I'm gone. Jacob kissed Sophie's forehead tenderly before turning towards the direction of the administrative building. Sophie stood there for a few seconds and then turned to walk towards the dorms. She knew that Jacob wanted to accompany her a bit more, but it was time for him to leave. His adventure into the Nine-Dragon Palace was indeed full of dangers, but his realm would increase greatly if he could return. Before he turned the corner, he saw Jade and Julia standing there, looking at him, alertly. He nodded his head in Sophie's direction. They understood his order and nodded in affirmative before moving to follow her. Jacob crossed the square before the library and came to the administration building. When he opened the door to Susan's office, he found her standing in a corner, looking out of the window. The office had been tidied up with the files stacked in the right corner of the desk, and chairs pushed under the desk. The array formation in the office had also been removed. "Let's go." Susan turned to look at Jacob and said lightly. The sun was setting when Jacob and Susan walked out of the administration building. After walking out of the college, Susan called a taxi, and they both remained silent the whole way to their destination. When they arrived at the apartment complex where Susan lived, Jacob followed her into the elevator. Susan was silent on the way, and Jacob didn't know what she was thinking. Jacob had been to Susan's home before, but he felt as if a lifetime had passed since he was here last time. Despite the messy kitchen, the apartment looked clean. However, the marble floor looked gloomy and cold in this weather. Susan lifted her wrist and checked her silver watch. "We'll set off at midnight." "Okay," Jacob nodded. "The dinner is instant noodles," Susan continued. "Of course," Jacob muttered under his breath, but had to agree to her suggestion. While Susan went straight to the kitchen to prepare the meal, Jacob leaned on the couch and turned on the TV. He surfed through the channels, thinking that this might be the last casual moment before their adventure. Susan clanked around with the pots and pans in the kitchen. Jacob wondered why she was making so much noise while cooking only instant noodles. They were alone in the big apartment. It felt lonesome but heavy. This was the silence before the storm. Susan returned to the living room with 2 bowls of instant noodles in her hands. Jacob smelled the aroma of the instant noodles and thought that Susan's cooking skills had improved. Meanwhile, the matchmaking show on the TV was showing good-looking guests with charming smiles. Seeing Jacob watching TV while eating the noodles, Susan suddenly picked up the remote control and turned off the TV. Jacob felt a bit frustrated when the TV was suddenly turned off while he was ready to hear one of the guests' self-introduction. Since Susan didn't like to talk, the room was plunged into silence after the only sound was turned off. Jacob ate the noodles noisily, trying to lighten the atmosphere. "Get yourself ready. It's not a field trip," Susan said. Got it." Jacob picked up the bowl and slurped the soup as well. Susan frowned and pursed her lips, thinking that Jacob was acting as if this were his own home. However, she didn't want to scold him or anything. She only thought that he was not taking it seriously enough. After finishing her own bowl, Susan went inside her room to change and make the final preparations. While eating the noodles, Jacob listened to the sounds of her moving around and finally hiccuped with great satisfaction. It was hard to say what would happen in the Nine-Dragon Palace, and Jacob had planned to have a good meal before they set off. However, Susan just treated him with instant noodles. "Forget it. I'm full anyway, and ready to fight in the Nine-Dragon Palace," he thought. He dumped the 2 paper bowls into the garbage can in the kitchen and sighed heavily when he saw the sink that was filled with dirty plates. Susan is terrible at housework. He rolled up his sleeves, picked up the detergent, turned on the tap, and began to wash the plates that had accumulated for about 5 to 6 days. What a great time I picked to start cleaning the dishes of all things, Jacob thought while he placed the clean plates and utensils into the cupboard. After walking out of the room in her changed clothes, Susan watched Jacob clean up the kitchen with a frown. Maybe he could reach the Heavenly Dragon Realm as well, Susan thought while she watched Jacob clean the dishes. Jacob washed the rag and hung it on the hook before the sink, before walking out of the kitchen. Standing at the door to her bedroom, Susan looked at him and said, "Drop the insignificant work. There are only 4 hours before we set off for the Nine-Dragon Palace. You must take the time to cultivate and get ready." "Okay." Jacob entered her cultivation room and sat down cross-legged. Following him into the room, Susan lit some incense and placed her long sword before her before closing her eyes to rest. They were going to the Nine-Dragon Palace, a place even the deputy shrine masters of the Dragon God Shrine couldn't enter without permission. Susan felt a bit nervous. Small ripples appeared in her mind. But quickly she suppressed her emotions with her technique, and her mind became smooth again, like the surface of a lake. Jacob placed his hands on his knees, exhaled deeply, and circulated his nature essence using the sword shadow scroll. Just as Susan had said, they were not going on a field trip, and they couldn't afford to be careless. Time ticked away silently in the quiet cultivation room. When Jacob was gathering all the nature essence into his dragon core, Susan's voice broke the silence. "It's time." With a slight push, Susan opened the window. The slim sword rose in the air automatically, and Susan slipped her feet into a pair of white boots before shooting out of the window on the sword. Without hesitation, Jacob jumped out of the window. The moment he began to drop, the gold hairpin appeared beneath his feet. With a golden light, he followed Susan closely. The Nine-Dragon Palace was somewhere on Fifth Heaven, but only Susan knew its precise location. After traveling above the misty lakes and mountains, Susan and Jacob entered Fifth Heaven. Susan observed the terrain and shot out a dragon nail. The silver nail shot into the mountain with a radiant white light. Standing on the longsword, Susan swept to the distance with extreme fast speed and shot out another silver dragon nail. Another light dot appeared in the rolling mountains. As long as a palm, the dragon nails were very powerful at building array formations and locating other treasures. Susan led Jacob around a mountain before shooting out another dragon nail. This place was far from Jacob's ethereal summit, and he had never been here before. While her longsword swept across a deep valley, Susan shot out another dragon nail towards a black mountain. After several tries, the 5 white lights flashed vaguely in the area, with a diameter of about 1,000 miles. "Go!" Susan threw out the longsword with all her force, releasing all the strength of top-tier 8th level. The black and white light instantly lit up this area with wondrous radiance. Susan cultivated both metal and water elemental nature essence. When the metal elemental nature essence reached its peak, it was white. And when the water elemental nature essence reached its peak, it would be black. Susan's current realm was close to peak 8th level. All the strength that she had accumulated was released suddenly. Muffled, thunderous noises sounded on the quiet 5th heaven in the night. Following Susan, Jacob saw a gray outline appear in the dark sky. The Nine-Dragon Palace. It was the Nine-Dragon Palace that Jacob had once seen. Like a huge city hovering in the air, it had lots of soil at the bottom, while the top was beyond his sight. Using all their cultivation strength in the attack, Susan broke the Nine-Dragon Palace's stealth. Although it was only a vague outline, they had a chance to enter it. Stepping back on the longsword, Susan dashed towards the Nine-Dragon Palace. The 5 dragon nails were stolen from the Dragon God Shrine, and they were holding the shadow of the Nine-Dragon Palace in place. However, it would last only for about 15 seconds. Possessing the power of seriously injuring peak 8th level cultivators, the dragon nails were treasures of the 6th Deputy Shrine Master, and each of them could be used only once. This Deputy Shrine Master only had 8 dragon nails left. Susan was taking a great risk to enter the Nine-Dragon Palace. She would die if she failed. Standing on the gold hairpin, Jacob followed her. Within seconds, the outline of the Nine-Dragon Palace began to dim, and would disappear in the darkness again. "It's the aura of dragon cultivators!" A furious roar suddenly came from 7th heaven. Instantly, powerful suppression crashed towards them from above, choking both of them. Almost at the same time, 5 to 6 treasures flew towards them with whistling sounds. The attackers were soul formation realm cultivators on 7th heaven. After the appearance of a supreme spiritual treasure on 6th heaven, they'd begun to pay attention to 5th and 6th heavens by leaving a trace of spiritual senses in these places. When Jacob and Susan entered 5th heaven at midnight, their movements couldn't escape the spiritual senses left behind by the soul formation realm cultivators, especially when Susan used all her power to force the 9-dragon palace to appear with the aid of 5 dragon nails. The booming sounds alerted the soul formation realm cultivators. On 5th heaven, which was far above the clouds on land, the thunderous noise could only mean that a cultivator was passing a lightning tribulation. To top that, with little effort, they had sensed the aura of dragon cultivators. Therefore, they attacked immediately. Not expecting that the soul formation realm cultivators would intervene, Jacob and Susan were alarmed when the treasures shot through the array formation between 6th and 5th heaven and crashed towards them. Susan had purposefully selected midnight to enter so that they wouldn't alert the human cultivators on 5th heaven. With her top-tier 8th level strength, she wasn't afraid of the nascent soul realm cultivators. But she wouldn't be able to force out the 9-dragon palace if a large group of human cultivators chased her. The soul formation realm cultivator had never cared much about the things happening on 5th heaven. But after the emergence of a supreme spiritual treasure and the incident around Ethereal Summit, they realized that they couldn't ignore 5th heaven anymore. Go! Seeing the treasures crashing towards them at lightning speed, Jacob worked up the chaotic lightning energy in his body and managed to break off the suppressions of the soul formation realm cultivators. While standing on the golden boat, he dashed behind Susan. Grabbing Susan's wrist, he raced towards the base of the disappearing 9-dragon palace, while the gold hairpin moved at its greatest speed. The 5 silver dragon nails suddenly shot out white lights on one spot at the base of the 9-dragon palace. After careful calculations, Susan had found this spot for them to enter the 9-dragon palace. She had done her investigations on 5th heaven by concealing her aura, but they were discovered by the soul formation realm cultivators from 7th heaven. Susan's long sword released a blinding light which opened a small crack in the 9-dragon palace's array formation. It was the weakest spot in the array formation. With her full strength, Susan was only able to create a small tunnel. Gritting his teeth, Jacob held Susan's wrist with force. On one side was a small crack in the array formation of the 9-dragon palace, and on the other side were the treasures launched by the soul formation realm cultivators from 7th heaven. Jacob flew into the small crack that was surrounded by colorful lights, with Susan behind him, feeling as if they had entered a wormhole with glowing lights. If they were a split second slower, he and Susan would be sealed in the array formation and squeezed into pieces. Jacob poured out the metal and water elemental nature essence from his body, pushing the gold hairpin to its greatest speed. It was fortunate that the gold hairpin wasn't an ordinary treasure. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to fly under the violent suppression of the array formation. With widened eyes, Susan's body tensed up like a piece of iron. Her calculation was perfect, but the unexpected delay caused by the soul formation realm cultivators at the most critical moment made them enter the crack in the array formation half a second late. They should have passed the crack with little risk, but now the situation was extremely dangerous. The array formation was closing right behind Jacob's heels. They both suddenly fell on the ground after being spat out by the array formation. Meanwhile, the treasures of the soul formation realm cultivators crashed on the edges of the array formation around the 9-dragon palace, and the dark outline of the 9-dragon palace was revealed again. However, even the treasures of the soul formation realm cultivators couldn't open the array formation, and they were bounced off one by one. The 9-dragon palace vanished into the darkness once again. Lying on the ground, Jacob panted heavily and touched his cheek with his left hand, finding that he was still alive. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked with closed eyes, bringing his other hand to his chest. After receiving no reaction from her, he turned to look at her cautiously. Susan's body was listless, and her eyes lost its usual sharpness, as if she had exhausted all her strength. and couldn't even get up from the ground. Jacob sat up and tried to pull her up by her wrist. "Let me rest for a while." Susan panted her words out while lying back down. Jacob suddenly remembered that in the Nine-Dragon Palace, which sealed the 5 elements, any cultivator who didn't have the chaotic energy, which was the combination of all 5 elements, were as weak as mortals. Despite her top-tier 8th level strength, Susan was just a mortal who couldn't use any of her cultivation techniques here. It was night outside of the Nine-Dragon Palace, and it was the same inside. It was so dark that Jacob couldn't see his own fingers if he didn't use his nature essence. Even with his super eyesight, Jacob could only see himself and Susan, and nothing beyond half a meter. Not able to cultivate or recover her nature essence, Susan rested her head on the ground and tried to recover some of her strength by using the traditional breathing method. Jacob didn't dare to move from his position, as in this dark night, if they got separated, they wouldn't be able to find each other again. It seemed that the sounds were blocked, and they couldn't travel far. The dull space felt like an invisible cage. Jacob thought that Susan would be able to make it by herself if he didn't come with her. She has no nature essence in the Nine-Dragon Palace and can only rely on me, and trusting her life in my hands. It's a great responsibility, he thought. "Let's find a place to hide during the night," Jacob said after a while. "We can't wander around," Susan said in a low voice. From a distance came roars of monsters. The roars sounded distant, but in the Nine-Dragon Palace, where the sounds were blocked, the beasts might be very close to them. "Except for when the 4 ocean dragon clans open it together. The Nine-Dragon Palace is full of beasts," Susan whispered. Either due to her weak strength or the intention to lower her voice, Susan's voice was very low. "What do we do now?" Jacob asked her. "We have to stay here until daytime, and we'll act after assessing the situation," Susan said. She had probably recovered some of her strength since her tone was stronger instead of soft and listless. The roars of beasts rose around them constantly. Jacob touched his chest and felt like they were lucky that they hadn't landed beside some beasts. They would have to engage in a fierce battle, or would have been swallowed by the beast without a chance to fight if that happened. Since they landed on the spot without the beast too close by, they could recover their strength slowly through the night. Even the first step in their adventure had been so dangerous. Jacob found it hard to imagine what other dangers were waiting for them. Although he couldn't see clearly in the dark night, he sensed that the Nine-Dragon Palace was a gloomy and damp place filled with a thick fog at night. They had landed on a flat land without any rocks that they could hide behind. At midnight, even the beasts didn't dare to move around, so it was the safest to stay where they were. The Nine-Dragon Palace at midnight was engulfed by darkness. The place was filled with all kinds of uncertainties and dangers, while beasts roared. "I have a blanket in my storage ring." Lying on the ground comfortably, Susan said suddenly. She lifted her finger towards Jacob. "Okay." Jacob understood the command and opened her storage ring by circulating the chaotic energy, taking out a thin knitted blanket. Despite the big space in his necklace, Jacob could only store stuff with nature essence. In contrast, Susan's storage ring couldn't store a lot of things, but she could place some ordinary objects in it. While he drew out the blanket, Jacob's spiritual senses felt around in her ring and found elixirs, bandages, and even ordinary medicines such as pills for the common cold. She was well prepared for the adventure. The reason that she had prepared some ordinary medicines was that she couldn't activate her nature essence in the Nine-Dragon Palace. If she caught a cold, she probably needed to take some medication. Thinking that the usual cold, Susan, an 8th level cultivator who had never worried about being ill, was now reduced into a weak mortal who had to prepare medicine for the common cold, Jacob felt like he had a huge responsibility here. Jacob did not need the blanket, as he could keep himself warm with his nature essence, so he handed it to Susan, who wrapped it around herself tightly. It wasn't her intention to reveal her weakness, but she didn't want to get sick after just getting into the Nine-Dragon Palace. It would be a worthless show of strength. The time ticked away, but the darkness didn't show any sign of receding. While practicing the Sword Shadow Scroll, Jacob continued to strengthen the chaotic energy in his body. With the abundant, natural chaotic energy that was nowhere to be found outside of the palace, it was a good place for Jacob to cultivate, if not for the beasts around them. Lying on the ground, Susan seemed to have fallen asleep. Jacob filled his meridians with chaotic energy and tried to make a breakthrough. He cultivated the 5 elements simultaneously with the Sword Shadow Scroll and formed chaotic energy with lightning cultivation. When Jacob came here last time, the Nine-Dragon Palace had been very peaceful, probably because the beast hid after the array formation was opened. At that time, Jacob could do nothing but throw out random chaotic sword energies, but it gained him a great advantage in that journey. As a demon beast, Snowflake could also move around in the Nine-Dragon Palace. Its level 5 strength was powerful in the eyes of human cultivators, but it was weak in front of the level 10 demon beasts in the Nine-Dragon Palace or the Demon Seat. That was why Jacob didn't bring Snowflake this time. Hearing the beast's roars around them, he knew that Snowflake was no match for them. The midnight mist in the Nine-Dragon Palace even blocked sounds, which meant that the roars were earth-shaking, since they could enter Jacob's ears. This time, Jacob was at the top-tier 5th level, and thus could use the chaotic sword array by combining 5 elements, making him hundreds of times more powerful than the last time. When the 4 Ocean Dragon clans opened it together, the Nine-Dragon Palace allowed only low-level cultivators to enter. At 5th level, Jacob and Susan would face dangers many times greater than before. A large group of beasts suddenly let out low roars. Susan was woken up by the low roars, and she sat up warily, listening to the sounds around them alertly. A huge gust blew over, and even Jacob was blown to the ground by such a powerful wind. Without nature essence, Susan fell onto the ground like a sheet of paper. In the dark night, Jacob couldn't see where the gust came from, but could feel that a huge beast had swept over them in the sky. The strong wind that could blow people to the ground was caused by the fluttering wings of that flying beast. "It's okay," Susan said, and sat up with her hands wrapped around herself. The nearby roaring beast quieted down, finally. Without wasting any time, Jacob sat up alertly and released tiny sword energies around them, with a range of 100 meters. He suddenly realized that they probably would find themselves surrounded by dozens of beasts when the sun appeared. The dark night made it impossible for them to move, but it was also a layer of protection because the beasts couldn't move around in the night either. The Sword Shadow Scroll combined Jacob's spiritual senses into the sword energies, and the sword energies were planted around them within 100 meters, able to alert them of dangers. However, he didn't release sword energies to areas further away, afraid that they would trigger the sleeping beasts. "You rest, and I'll keep guard." Jacob turned to look at Susan and said, "Okay." Susan pulled the blanket back over her and laid back down. Jacob sat cross-legged and exhaled silently. In the darkness, the beasts would occasionally roar together in low voices, probably because some flying beast had disturbed their sleep. With closed eyes, Jacob kept his mind on the faint sword energies that he had planted in the ground, without a moment of relaxation. When Jacob felt numbness in his hands and feet, a radiant light suddenly appeared in the east. Instantly, thousands of beasts roared. Feeling like the daytime was coming, Jacob immediately woke Susan up, rolled up the knitted blanket, and put it into her storage ring. He beckoned. The hundreds of sword energies that were scattered around returned to his palm. The Nine-Dragon space was in a secluded space without the sun, the moon, and other stars. This blinding light must have come from the array formation, which was circulating automatically. Feeling like the beasts would wake up from their sleep soon, Jacob tossed out the gold hairpin to leave on it, but he realized that he couldn't use it. Since the 5 elements were blocked in the palace, He couldn't activate the metal and water elemental nature essence alone, which meant that he couldn't use this powerful treasure. The white light lit up all the corners in the Nine Dragon Palace almost instantly. Jacob saw all kinds of huge beasts walking on the broad plain. There were big and small beasts in the valley, and forests farther away too. In the misty sky were huge birds that were as wide as hundreds of meters. Their sharp beaks spat out flames. The rolling mountains were endless. Standing on mountain tops, some unknown beast bit off a tree trunk that had a cross-sectional diameter of about 6 meters and chewed it up. They were all prehistoric beasts. If he didn't witness it himself, Jacob could never imagine such a magnificent sight. The ancient cultivators had faced such beasts. How could the present-day cultivators do any damage to them? He thought. A black-skinned beast by the lake raised its head and roared with fury, and dozens of gray jackals that had flames emitting from their paws immediately retreated from the meadow. The black-skinned beast raised its thick front leg and crushed a dozen jackals into meat pies. Frightened, Jacob took Susan's hand and flew towards a nearby forest by releasing chaotic sword energies under his feet. While the light was still spreading across the land, the plains, valleys, and forests were just struggling out of darkness. Everything was engulfed in red lights. About a dozen weird birds flew out from the forest that Jacob was heading towards. These weird birds looked ugly and evil with colorful feathers, which gave people a sense of danger instead of beauty. After all, poisonous snakes were usually colorful. Jacob released his chaotic sword energies. The weird birds had their heads pierced by the sword energies and fell down before they could slash their sharp claws at Jacob. Suddenly, their bodies released colorful vapor, which was highly toxic. It could even numb and kill the huge beasts that were as tall as 100 meters. Sensing the killing power in the vapor, Jacob and Susan hurried out of the area. In the area within hundreds of meters of the spot where the weird birds dropped, the trees withered quickly before rotting to the ground. If Jacob had acted 1 second slower, he would have ended up the same. He shot sword energies into the dense forest to investigate, even though he didn't see any beasts with his eyes. Each sword energy carried his spiritual senses, and he instantly knew that no beasts were lurking inside. Then he landed in the forest with Susan. From shooting out the sword energies and killing a dozen weird birds, to sending the sword energies into the forest before landing, Jacob's movements were smooth and quick without any hesitation. However, he didn't feel as calm as he looked. When he landed on the soft soil in the forest, his clothes were soaked by sweat. When those dozens of weird birds dashed out, he would have died if he had reacted half a second slower or were not alert enough. It was a narrow escape, and the adventure had just begun. Seeing the birds and beasts all over the place, Jacob realized that the number of beasts in the Nine Dragon Palace far surpassed his imagination. In the Demon Sea, demon beasts all lurked under the sea. But in the Nine Dragon Palace, the demon beasts ran around freely, and there were even flying beasts. It was hard to determine the realms of these beasts, but Jacob guessed that they were at least level 6 or 7. He couldn't handle them with ease. There are no directions, such as north, south, east, or west here. But I think we're on the edge of this world. With one hand resting on a huge tree, Susan said calmly while she looked into the valley and observed the terrain and lights carefully. We need to cross this plain and the mountain on the other side to see if we can find a route, she told him. The information about the inside of the Nine Dragon Palace was the top secret among secrets, but she had gathered enough fragmented information from the ancient scrolls and the Dragon God Shrine to get a vague layout of the place. That was why she knew her whereabouts, even though she had never been here before. While she was talking, she saw Jacob take something out of his storage necklace. She looked at him and handed her the gold hairpin. This is Lady Carter's treasure. It carries her aura.
it means that it probably has some suppressing effects on these beasts. You'll be safer wearing it." Jacob looked at her and said. Susan froze for a moment, then nodded and put the pin in her hair. She knew that the gold hairpin was Lady Carter's treasure, and thus had some suppressing effects on the demon beast. But she was surprised that Jacob had given it to her for protection, instead of keeping this useful treasure for himself. As a token from Lady Carter, the gold hairpin could fend off the high-level demon beasts in the Demon Sea. Although the demon beasts in the Nine Dragon Palace probably didn't know about the power of the gold hairpin, it was a treasure that an eternal demon king carried with her. It would fend off some low-level demon beasts at the least. Let's go. After getting a clear idea of the layout of the demon beasts in the valley and on the plain, Jacob circulated the chaotic sword energy and pulled Susan onto it with him before flying towards the mountain on the other side. The moment that Jacob flew up, he suddenly saw a magnificent, black, ancestral dragon palace flying across the sky before vanishing into the distance in the blink of an eye. When he was in the Nine Dragon Palace last time, he had entered 2 ancestral dragon palaces and knew that they were very heavy and made with huge black stones. However, such a massive building was flying so swiftly in the air. What kind of power was required for that? Usually, when the 4 ocean dragon clans open the Nine Dragon Palace every 50 years, the 9 ancestral dragon palaces always change their positions. Turns out that while array formation was in operation, the 9 big palaces were continuously flying around in the Nine Dragon Palace. The Black Palace disappeared in the distance, and Jacob didn't even see which palace it was. "Let's go," Susan reminded Jacob, who was lost in his thoughts. Okay. The shock that Jacob received was beyond words. The 9 ancestral dragon palaces were moving in a predetermined pattern. It was a major void array. The center of the 9 palaces must be the core of the Nine Dragon Palace and the array formation. Only when the 4 ocean dragon palaces opened the 9 dragon palaces together, the array formation would stop operating temporarily, and the palaces would land on the ground in different positions. While he was speculating the movement pattern of the palaces, Jacob moved the chaotic sword energy towards the foot of the mountain. Once they arrived at that place, Susan's nature essence would fully recover. Jacob's main responsibility was to help her cross this area full of mountains and wild beasts. Jacob landed lightly on a stretch of grassland. The wild grass was more than 2 meters tall, hiding Jacob and Susan's whereabouts. In front of the beasts that were usually hundreds of meters tall, they were as tiny as 2 insects. Susan praised Jacob's route choice silently, as it aligned with her own. It seemed that Jacob was also observant and had a quick mind. "We can't get separated," she reminded him. Due to Susan's loss of nature essence in the Nine Dragon Palace, Jacob couldn't sense her location easily, and they couldn't use modern communication devices. If they got separated, they would be in trouble. While they walked, Susan gripped her long sword tightly. But since she couldn't circulate nature essence, she barely had the strength of a martial arts master. Jacob's sword energies floated at the top of the 2-meter-tall grass to scout the area around them. They were now at least about a dozen miles away from the mountain on the other side, and it was the most dangerous distance that they needed to cover. Several huge white birds flew in the sky, and they both dropped down onto the ground in a hurry. All the green grass was blown down by the huge wind, revealing a few small beasts that were hiding in the grass. The huge white birds reached out their iron-like claws, dashed down to the ground, and grabbed 5 to 6 small beasts before tearing them into pieces. Then they flew to the distance with blood dripping from their claws. Due to their small sizes, Susan and Jacob's bodies were covered by the 2-meter-tall green grass as it tilted sideways, helping them hide. After the huge birds flew away, the grass bounced back. Jacob raced forward with Susan. The attack from the huge birds frightened the small beasts in the grass, making it the perfect moment for them to cross this grassland. A sharp whistling sound suddenly came from Jacob's back. He turned his head and saw another huge bird hovering in the sky and throwing a huge rock towards him. 1,280 sword energies merged into 256 chaotic sword energies and stabbed towards the rock. With a loud noise, the huge black rock was shattered by Jacob's sword energies before falling on the ground. Jacob was about to heave a sigh of relief when he found a silent shadow moving towards him from another side. Another huge white bird soared towards him with great speed, while its fluttering white wings created almost no air currents. Jacob, who had just cast all his sword energies, was ashen-faced with shock, knowing that he had underestimated the hunting skills of the beast in the Nine-Dragon Palace. Susan stabbed her sword forward while her body leaned backwards. The long sword flew out for dozens of meters, while Susan was sent flying for more than 10 meters, even though she escaped from the claws of the huge bird. "Susan!" Jacob yelled and hurried towards her. A burning flame swept towards Jacob from the back. The white bird that had attacked Jacob first struck towards his shoulders. These two birds surrounded them and attacked separately. The huge birds had an intricate hunting strategy. With the one-on-one strategy, they wouldn't allow Jacob and Susan to get together again. When Jacob was about to be hit, the sword energies around him condensed into a colorful energy sword as he used the first strike of the water sword techniques. His sword cut off one claw of the huge bird. In pain, the bird that attacked him flew up. Jacob looked back and saw Susan rolling in the grass, while the other huge bird clawed up pounds of soil from the ground beside her. She escaped the claw by a few inches. Otherwise, it would have torn her into pieces. Without her sword or any nature essence, Susan was pale. She was about to leap up and roll again when the other claw of the bird dashed towards her like a small mountain. Susan clearly saw the red flames at the center of the claw. Dodging it was impossible. She closed her eyes, ready to take this fatal blow. Suddenly, a loud noise almost shattered her eardrums. She opened her eyes and saw Jacob flying up with both hands, holding the colorful sword energy, piercing the claw, and blocking the powerful attack for her. The flames in the center of the claw were suddenly jetted out, knocking Jacob back onto the muddy ground like a cannonball. "Go!" The moment that Jacob flew out, he waved his arms and commanded that energy sword. The colorful energy sword, which had pierced through the claw, suddenly shot up into the long, slim neck of the huge white bird. The colorful energy sword suddenly shattered and turned into hundreds of chaotic sword energies, exploding in its long neck. The bird, that was more than 100 meters tall, fell to the ground. Susan watched in shock, and then stood up with dirty hands while panting heavily. Seeing its partner killed, the other bird that had lost a toe let out a shrill cry before flying away. The two huge birds were behind the group. After seeing that the other bird was killed, this one didn't linger around. It fled to join its group in a hurry. Jacob turned and looked at Susan with fear in his eyes, and sweat was dripping from his forehead. Although the battle lasted only a moment, and they used only 3 attacks, it was an incredibly chilling experience. After dashing over to pick up her longsword, Susan beckoned at him and raced towards their destination, not giving a thought to the wound on her shoulder. She was afraid that the huge birds would return. If they did, she and Jacob wouldn't be able to fight them. Seeing her purple sweater turning red by the blood that was oozing from her shoulder, Jacob also didn't dare to stop and bandage her wound. He ran after her. After running for almost 1 hour, when the huge birds didn't return, they finally stopped for a break. Their eyes met. They both felt lucky after the narrow escape. "The medicine is in my ring," Susan lifted her hand and said. Jacob opened her ring and dug out a dark red glass medicine bottle from her ring. With a frown, Susan opened the bottle and put some red medicine solution on her shoulder. From her furrowed eyebrows, Jacob knew that she was hurting from the stinging in the wound, which was caused by the solution. She handed the bottle to Jacob, who then put it back into her ring. Jacob wanted to ask her if she needed to rest for a few minutes, but Susan had already begun walking with clenched teeth. "We must cross that mountain before dark. Otherwise, we won't find a hiding place, and we will die." She looked back at him after walking a few steps and said. Jacob turned to look at the almost boundless plain and the flying or running beasts. He had to admit that Susan was right. "Let's go." He nodded and strode forward steadily. In this open space, flying on his sword energy was the most dangerous act. The relatively safer way was to walk, concealed by the high wild grass, to reach the mountain on the other side. The 2-meter-tall wild grass grew in the mud, and it was exhausting to trudge through the mud for them. It would take people several hours to walk more than 10 miles, even on a highway, let alone in the 9-Dragon Palace, which was full of beasts. The level 8 and 9 beasts possessed some degree of intelligence, but fortunately they hadn't transformed yet, and didn't possess true intelligence. Despite the same environment as the Demon Sea, Jacob and Susan hadn't seen any Transformation Realm beasts while they trudged through the grasslands. "There should be level 10 demon beasts here, but I don't know if there are any Transformation Realm demon beasts," Susan said while she stumbled through the mud. "I don't think so, since the 9-Dragon Palace is sealed off from the outside world, and there's no heavenly lightning for them to pass the transformation tribulation," Jacob said. Susan turned her eyes towards Jacob and realized that he was right after a moment of consideration. She was surprised that Jacob was so familiar with the details of heavenly tribulations. She didn't know that Jacob had gained some knowledge about the habits and features of demon beasts after his trip to the Demon Sea, especially how they passed heavenly tribulations. It was why he had a general idea of the movement patterns of the ancient beasts in the 9-Dragon Palace, and had chosen the safest route accordingly to reach the mountain on the other side. The longer Susan walked with Jacob, the more experienced she thought he was, and thus the more confident she felt. The sky had brightened. There was no sun here, but Jacob estimated that it was about noon, and they had covered less than half of the distance. If they didn't speed up, they wouldn't be able to reach the mountain on the other side before nightfall, and beasts on the plains would surround them. More importantly, they probably wouldn't be able to fend off the cold during the night. After entering the 9-Dragon Palace at midnight, Susan almost couldn't bear the chill, even though it had been only half a night. Today she was wounded and exhausted. If she couldn't have a good rest, she would find it difficult to pass the night. The chilliness in the 9-Dragon Palace was different. No matter how much they wore, they couldn't fend off the chill alone. They must increase their speed. Determined, they both started running forward like two shooting arrows. Running on the muddy ground, they dashed through the dense grass. The gray sword energies followed them like hundreds of cameras, scouting the surrounding area. In the 9-Dragon Palace, which was full of chaotic energy, Jacob was like a fish in the water. The only drawback was that his realm was lower than those demon beasts, so he didn't dare to fight them head-on. Though Susan was having a hard time keeping up with him, she was determined to not fall behind. Jacob's sword energy suddenly flew to the side and exploded a fierce black beast that was at least 2 meters tall. They both sped up and continued to run, but the sword energies hit again and knocked away a black 3-tailed tiger that was lurking in the grass on the left. The 2-meter-tall wild grass shook in waves, as if small beasts were running around in it. Spitting black flames from their nostrils, 2 3-tailed black tigers sprang at the spot where the grass shook, surrounding the prey from the front and the back with their excellent hunting skills. Jacob grabbed Susan's hand and moved quickly, as if small engines powered his legs. The 2 black tigers leapt up at the same time, crashing towards the movement in the grass. With a wave of flashing lights, sword energies shot out from the grass and disappeared gradually. Susan looked back and saw the tigers leaping up, which made her admire Jacob's smart strategy. He had made the grass move with his sword energies and thus drew the tigers towards the opposite direction, buying them time to escape. "We've reached the end." Jacob suddenly stopped and dropped her hand, and Susan almost fell to the ground from exhaustion. Gritting her teeth, she took a deep breath and looked up. She saw that they had reached the edge of the grassy swamp on this vast plain, and there was a big grassland in the clearing before them. Although grass could conceal all kinds of beasts, it also offered them protection from the beasts. However, it was difficult to reach the mountain on the other side if they had to travel through the open clearing. If they waited until midnight, the chilling cold was one problem. Also, traveling through the resting places of the beasts in the dark night was a greater and almost impossible challenge. "There are about..." Jacob looked into the distance ahead and said, 5 to 6 miles left." Since an ancestral dragon palace had flown across the mountain on the other side, Jacob had the optimistic notion that there were probably less beasts in the mountain, which meant they would be safer there. He moved his arm, and the chaotic sword energies that were floating in the wind returned to his palm. "Shall we dash over?" Jacob looked at Susan's face and asked. "What percentage of success do you think we have?" Susan asked with a grim expression. 30%, he answered. He felt like the beasts didn't move fast despite their enormous sizes, and it would give them a chance to dash through. "Let's go," Susan decided without hesitation. She took another deep breath and stood straight. "Okay." Jacob moved the sword energies from his palms to his feet instantly, lifting them. "Try to balance," Jacob reminded her. Susan rolled her eyes and thought, "Don't need to remind me." Up. Spotting the beasts on the land, Jacob created a gray energy sphere before shooting towards the distant mountain. Just as Jacob expected, the beasts here could see through the energy sphere formed by his chaotic sword energies. With furious roars, they dashed towards Jacob and Susan. He had expected that the energy sphere, which could block mortals' views, was useless against the beasts, but he had underestimated their speed. The seemingly clumsy, big-sized beasts suddenly covered thousands of meters instantly as if they were flying. The beasts, which had been resting in the distance, were suddenly only hundreds of meters from them. Meanwhile, all kinds of lights shot out from their claws, eyes, and mouths. Although the level 8 and 9 beasts didn't possess full intelligence, they were conquerors with countless battle experience. Jacob took a deep breath and used the connate nature essence in his body. It began to circulate like crazy. This was the 5 elemental nature essence that he had cultivated during the week when he had lost all his nature essence. After he recovered his realm, it was converted into a connate nature essence, which was unique and precious. At this critical moment, he had to use it even though it couldn't be replenished. The gray sword energy beneath his feet shot out a gray light beam, while his speed tripled. Release. Jacob's gray sword energies shot out in all directions. He had to release Darius's 1,000-year cultivation strength. Hundreds of blinding sword energies containing intense, chaotic lightning energy pushed the energy in the 9-Dragon Palace towards more than 10 high-level beasts that were trying to surround them. Almost instantly, the sword energy that carried Jacob and Susan dashed out from these beasts' traps. Jacob's sword energy dashed into the mountain on the other side like a shooting star. The wounded beasts got wild, began to attack each other, biting and clawing, turning the relatively quiet grassland into chaos. Jacob and Susan passed the peak and fell to the other side of the mountain. Susan rolled on the ground, leaving several scratches on her body. Meanwhile, the sword energy shot into the cliff, and Jacob crashed onto the rock, making a deep crater in it. Alarmed, Susan drew out her longsword and climbed into the rock. She tried to look inside the deep and dark crater. "I'm fine." Climbing out from the crater, Jacob smiled at Susan, with a face full of debris. Susan rolled her eyes at his silly smile and turned around to observe this side of the mountain. They were facing another big grassland, but there was no trace of beasts here, as if they all stayed on the other side of the mountain. A black ancestral dragon palace soared in the sky at an extremely fast speed, while another black dot was moving in the distance. It must be another palace. Jacob brushed the debris off his cheeks and stood beside Susan to observe the situation. He had thought that his realm would be greatly damaged, but besides some wounds on his body, the connate nature essence in his body had been replenished quickly by chaotic energy. In the Nine Dragon Palace, the intense chaotic energy was boundless. With Jacob's low realm, he could open his meridians and fill them with the outside chaotic energy freely. It was a perfect place for cultivation. Susan turned her head and found that Jacob had turned energetic again, in the blink of an eye. "He is a weird creature, and I have made the right decision to ask him to come along," she thought. "You observe the directions and see which route we can take," Jacob said in a steady voice. "Okay." Susan nodded and studied the terrain on this side of the mountain carefully. She had looked through all the materials in the Dragon God Shrine, including those ancient scrolls that only Deputy Shrine Masters had access to. That was why she had a general idea of the place, even though it was her first time entering the Nine Dragon Palace. "I want to go to the Origin Dragon Palace." "You must have been there before," Susan said. Jacob thought for a while, and remembered that when he entered the Nine Dragon Palace the first time, the first place he went into was a huge black palace in which the dragon god was worshipped. By the flying routes of the small ancestral dragon palaces, my guess is that the Origin Dragon Palace should be in the center, which is the hub of the ray formation of the whole Nine Dragon Palace, Susan continued. "Let's go, then." Without another word, Jacob started walking down the mountain. This mountain separated the large plain into two zones. On one side lived all kinds of beasts, while the other side was unimaginably quiet. Jacob thought about it and realized that he and Sophie probably had landed in this zone, which was protected for the first time. The green plains at the foot of the mountain were very beautiful, while the air was refreshing. "It will get dark in a few hours. We must find a place for the night," Susan reminded Jacob after walking for hours. "Okay, let's go to the top of that hill," Jacob said while looking up at the ancestral dragon palace, which flew across the sky again, and then pointed at a small hill before them. They sped up a little and kept moving towards the hill. Just as Susan predicted, the sky darkened slowly. They climbed along a gentle slope towards the hill, trying to find a place for the night. Sky Heart Bamboo. Walking ahead of Jacob, Susan's eyes lit up. In a valley, about a dozen green bamboos were swaying in the wind. The Sky Heart Bamboo was the top-tier material for making sword-shaped treasures, but it was extinct in the outside world. Susan had tried to find such material, but couldn't find any all over the world. However, she found more than 10 flourishing Skyheart bamboos in the Nine Dragon Palace. It must be noted that the Skyheart bamboo grew only 1 inch in 100 years. Right now, these bamboos were more than 1 meter long. Susan ran over in exhilaration and cut down one with her longsword. The sword, made with Skyheart bamboo, was very light. Despite their slow-growing speed, they were very fragile. Even an ordinary weapon could cut them down. This was why the Skyheart bamboo had become extinct. Susan was about to pick up 2 pieces of bamboo and ask Jacob to put them into his necklace when a black insect crawled out from the soft soil where the sky-heart bamboo grew. The insect was as big as a palm. When it broke out from the soil, it suddenly expanded and revealed long, sharp knives like a mantis. Startled, Susan reacted quickly. She drew out the longsword from her belt and blocked the half-meter-long black, sharp knife that the weird insect slashed out. The tip of the sharp knife cut a long wound in Susan's lower leg. At this critical moment, Jacob's sword energy suddenly shot out from Susan's shoulder and cut the insect into 2 halves. While thick, black liquid oozed out of the body of the insect, Susan picked up the 2 pieces of sky-heart bamboo and backed off, stumbling backwards. "Are you okay?" Jacob asked her while saving her from falling down. The soil where the sky-heart bamboo grew turned black, gradually after getting contaminated by the thick liquid. The fragile sky-heart bamboos turned from green to black, withering and falling. Susan regulated her breathing with concentration and finally regained her composure. If Jacob had acted half a second slower, she would have died under the second strike. "I've checked. I think the spot further away is a good place for us to stay the night." Jacob patted her shoulder lightly and said in a low voice, "Okay." Susan immediately stood up straighter. Seeing Jacob walking ahead, she thought for a moment and limped closer, trying to keep up with him. The lack of beasts didn't mean that it was completely safe. She was a little shaken after the insect attack. Walking forward, Jacob shot out dozens of sword energies into a rocky surface, opening a small cave with a depth of about 5 meters. Then he asked Susan for the gold hairpin and planted it in the ground at the entrance for its effects of suppression on demon beasts. During the day, when the weird bird attacked Susan, it probably had sensed the aura of a demon king from the gold hairpin and thus hesitated, giving Jacob the precious time to save her. Susan slowly limped her way inside the cave and sat down, looking at her wound. She had a bad feeling when she saw black blood oozed from the wound in her right lower leg. Soon, Jacob returned to the cave with a big pile of straw and twigs in his arms. He shot out a small lightning bolt and lit the straw and twigs, creating a small bonfire. The sky turned dark in the blink of an eye. The fire in the cave illuminated Jacob and Susan's faces. "How is your leg?" After laying the remaining straws on the ground, Jacob sat opposite Susan. There was a deep wound in her lower leg, and a trace of black blood was mingled in the red blood that was oozing out. He looked down and saw a pool of black blood on the ground. It seemed that Susan had tried to handle her wound while he was out collecting twigs. The poison is still in there. Jacob took out a detox pill from his necklace and broke it in the 2 halves. He gave half of it to Susan to eat and ground the other half before applying the powder onto her wound. The detox pill worked immediately, and all the black blood came out of Susan's leg on its own. Once that was done, Jacob got into the position to cultivate. Susan looked at him quietly and exhaled a little. Then she sat down and closed her eyes. Without nature essence, she couldn't cultivate, so she was going to sleep to regain her energy for the next day. When she woke up, the twigs and the fire had burned up, leaving only dim embers and the ashes to maintain the warmth in the cave. After looking at Jacob, who was still in the same position as she had last seen him, Susan turned her gaze towards the light at the entrance of the cave. It was morning. "We have a long way to go today. When will you get up?" Susan looked back at Jacob and asked. Jacob opened his eyes, hearing her voice, and stood up. He knew that she was embarrassed as she couldn't cultivate and slept off, which she herself considered lazy. "You sense your realm." Susan looked at him with a frown and said, "Stay tuned to Pocket FM for Season 2 of Married to the Dragon King's Daughter. Until then, enjoy some of our other exciting stories."